Hello and welcome to the Washington, D.C. launch event for UNFPA's 2023 State of the World Population Report. I'm Sarah Barnes, and I direct the Maternal Health Initiative at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C., and I'm zooming in today from Bern, Switzerland. We are honored to be hosting this incredible launch event today with our esteemed partners at UNFPA. The 2023 State of the World Population Report, or SWOP report, is titled 8 Billion Lives, Infinite Possibilities, the Case for Rights and Choices. This is an incredible report focused on several themes that the Maternal Health Initiative, as well as our co-host, the Environmental Change and Security Program, focus on quite closely at the Wilson Center, primarily population changes, including fertility, migration, mortality and aging societies, gender equality, and sexual and reproductive health and rights. This report challenges readers to start asking different questions when discussing population changes and to move away from the rhetoric of population alarmists, often armed with reactive approaches to population changes. Reactive approaches tend to want to control or manipulate natural population trends, ultimately leading to less rights and choices for citizens, particularly the world's women and their reproductive autonomy. This report discourages unhelpful discussions of too many or too few when discussing the world's population and urges us to move to an approach centered on demographic resilience, choices, and rights. Demographic resilience, as defined in this report, describes the ability of a system to adapt to, anticipate, and thrive amid demographic changes. An approach centered on demographic resilience attempts to prepare for such changes to ensure that the needs and rights of everyone in society are adequately met. And population is ultimately about people. Whether we're talking about fertility, migration, or mortality trends, we are talking about people. And having just surpassed a global population of 8 billion, this report seizes the opportunity to change the population narrative to be one centered on the choices and rights of the world's 8 billion and counting. I want to thank UNFPA and the authors for this report, and a special thank you to UNFPA for partnering with the Wilson Center again this year to launch the annual State of the World Population Report. I'd also like to thank our esteemed speakers who are here with us today. We are truly grateful for your time and your expertise, and I look forward to learning from each of you. Thank you also to our live audience for joining us today. We encourage you to be engaged in the discussion. You can submit questions for our panelists in the chat box on your screen just below the webcast video, and we'll do our best to get to each of your questions. You can also follow the discussion on Twitter at Wilson_MHI with the hashtags 8 Billion Lives, SWOP 2023, and MH Dialogue. We have a packed agenda today. So without further ado, it is my honor and privilege to introduce our first speaker, Representative Chrissy Houlihan. Representative Houlihan is a dynamic member of the U.S. House of Representatives. She is an Air Force veteran, engineer, entrepreneur, and educator who is continuing her career of service as the first ever woman to represent Pennsylvania's 6th District in Congress. Representative Houlihan, welcome back to the Wilson Center's virtual stage. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Sarah. And can you hear me okay? Oh, excellent, excellent. Technology finally working for us. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you all. I am speaking to you from Washington, D.C., so this is truly a global conversation. Thank you for those really kind words of introduction, and of course for the work that you all are doing at the Wilson Center to advance issues like the ones we're talking about, those of maternal health. Good morning, everyone. I am Chrissy Houlihan. I do represent Pennsylvania's 6th Congressional District, which is just outside of the city of Philadelphia in southeastern Pennsylvania. And I am really, really honored to be speaking to you all for the third time, for the third year at UNFPA's launch for your State of the World Population Report. And I really don't think that it's an overstatement to say the world would be certainly a much more dangerous place if it weren't for organizations that are working like the UNFPA and the Wilson Center. So thank you. I am also, as Sarah has mentioned, really excited to talk about this year's report topic or title. The 8 Billion Lives, Infinite Possibilities, The Case for Rights and Choices is a really apropos title. And the executive summary talks a lot about important milestones, one of them being that we now do have 8 billion people on the planet. The use of the word incredible is something that my father always taught me to use appropriately. Incredible meaning unbelievable. It is truly unbelievable that we have reached that landmark number. And I'm sure that many of you guys have heard or even been part of these kinds of concerning conversations about the global population and about the impacts of climate change and access to our resources that it is causing. On the other hand, we have also heard similar kind of parallel conversations of concern about the declining birth rates and the impact that that is having on economies. Certainly, you've heard words like collapse being used in those conversations. So, if you're like me, you know that both arguments can be true at the same time, and they both have a shared thread or theme. And as Sarah was highlighting and highlighted by this report, the common thread or theme is a certain attempt to control the influence that people have over women's bodily autonomy and reproductive rights. It seems as though no matter what women do, our reproductive choices are kind of blamed on society's ills, whether it's the planet dying and crashing and burning, or whether it's becoming too populated. And heaven forbid we look at other factors like greenhouse gases or efforts to eliminate and defund social programs as causes to also be concerned about. So if we're ever going to turn the focus to real solutions and to real change rather than scapegoating, we definitely need to make sure that we're removing the conversation of reproductive autonomy from that list of those debatable concepts. We as a global community need to make sure that we're affirming for all that reproductive rights is not and should not be a political hot potato to use to score points against opponents or as a tool to continue to discriminate against 51% of the world's population. And if we're really truly concerned about things like economic stability, then why are we ignoring studies that consistently show that regions where women are economically empowered are regions where there's greater community safety and longer and more durable peace times? So economic empowerment is definitely directly related to women having full control over their reproductive choices. So how can we change these conversations? And these are the ways we can do that. This conversation right now is that with awareness, with reports like this one that explain this issue and offer concrete solutions to the issues that we're all struggling with, and with the tireless work of organizations like the Wilson Center and like the UNFPA. I've been really, really fortunate during my time in Congress to be able to support this vital work. We will soon be reintroducing for the third time this legislation that urges Congress to continue to fund UNFPA. And I look forward to gathering more co-sponsors than ever before to make sure that we can express our support for something so important as this. I genuinely still hold out hope that some of my colleagues from across the aisle will also join me in that effort. I'm really sad that we have to keep having these conversations. You know, I'm really sad that here in the United States, we frankly are going backwards and have to renew our fight for all of the kinds of things that we thought we had settled on decades ago. I'm very, very sad that as we speak, that medication that is proven to be safe and effective for ending unwanted or dangerous pregnancies is now in jeopardy here in these United States. But I am not discouraged, and I hope that you all aren't either. I'm continue to work in the halls of Congress and in my community and my Commonwealth in this country to help improve access to healthcare and education, not just here in the United States, but also around the world, because we all understand how important women's reproductive autonomy is. You guys are doing something that's not easy work, and I know that it will mean an enormous amount when we are able to chalk successes up on the scoreboard. I want to thank you so much for your very tireless work in this area and these critical issues. I want to thank you very much for inviting me today, and I want to thank the UNFPA and the Wilson Center for what is this groundbreaking report. Thanks very much, and I look forward to hearing your conversation.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Representative Houlihan. Each year, I look forward to hearing your commentary on that year's State of the World Population Report, and you did not disappoint again this year. We greatly appreciate your unwavering support for the reproductive health of all, especially the world's women and girls. Thank you so much. Our next speaker wasn't able to join us live, but we are grateful to him and his team for producing recorded opening remarks. I'm happy to now introduce Dr. Atul Gawande. Dr. Gawande is USAID's Assistant Administrator for Global Health. He is a renowned surgeon, writer, and public health leader. Prior to joining the Biden-Harris administration, he was a practicing surgeon at Brigham and Women's Hospital and a professor at Harvard Medical School and the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. If you could please play his video now, thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I am delighted to join you virtually to mark the launch of UNFPA's 2023 State of the World Population Report. Thank you to the Wilson Center for hosting today's discussion, and to UNFPA for your long-standing commitment to the empowerment of women and girls across the world. The United States is proud to partner with you and support UNFPA's life-saving work in sexual and reproductive health, in preventing maternal deaths, in expanding access to voluntary family planning, and in preventing and responding to gender-based violence around the world. I'm also selfishly proud that many of the population estimates presented in the State of the World Population Report draw on data that USAID has supported from our nearly 40-year investment in the Demographic and Health Surveys program to our 60-year partnership with the U.S. Census Bureau. USAID is committed to partnering with governments so they have the population and health data they need to plan for healthy communities. I also see this year's State of the World's Population Report as something much bigger than population numbers. The report urges us to recognize that we're now a world of 8 billion people, and that is the result of a milestone in global development. Over the course of the last century, human life expectancy has doubled. This is a massive achievement brought about by science, innovation, behavior change, and more. And it has brought us a world where maternal death is a preventable tragedy, where most newborns make it through their first precarious moments of life, where we can prevent and fight deadly disease with vaccines, antibiotics, and antiretrovirals. It's a world where individuals can make decisions about whether and when and with whom to have a child. That is a triumph. But this triumph is at risk of faltering. The health and well-being of humanity is under threat. In the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic, we are experiencing the first decline in global life expectancy since World War II, with a staggering 15 million deaths or more reported worldwide from the impact of the pandemic. COVID's devastation is not limited to a tragic loss of life. The pandemic weakened health systems with enduring negative consequences. We're seeing years of gains and investment wiped away, and we're only starting to see the effects. I'm here with the message that we can reclaim our lost ground and resume the past decades of advancement in human survival and health, but that requires holding on to our sense of urgency and doing more than simply hoping things will turn around. We owe that to ourselves, and we owe it to future generations. At USAID, where I get to oversee foreign assistance for health, we are focusing our efforts on recovery and building the resilience of health systems by investing in the people who form the backbone of those systems, our primary health workers. Primary care providers are often the first contact we have with the healthcare system. They diagnose and treat common illnesses, they spot health problems before they become serious ones, they provide counseling to women and couples on how to achieve their desired family size, and they're the first on the front lines to keep their communities safe during a health crisis. And primary care workers don't just fight disease when they're supported in the right way. They build community health. In Ghana, for example, when researchers tested in a randomized trial the impact of financing neighborhood health clinics that included outreach workers and primary care nurses who are trained at a level that could provide first level care, as well as offering preventive measures such as family planning, the results were dramatic. The share of families choosing to use contraception increased by 1/3, which in turn helped cut child mortality in half. Building stronger primary health systems is about more than a one-stop shop to get the necessary tests and treatments. It's about building relationships of trust and communication between neighborhoods and their health system. The primary health workers who counsel couples on contraceptive options, who help them deliver a healthy baby, and who provide immunizations to that child are the same ones the family will go to if they have an unexplained illness, or if the elders in their family need extra support. Beyond individual health, building these primary health systems makes the community and the country, as well as the region, safer. But building primary care systems requires substantial investment, a formidable challenge for countries who have strained resources in the wake of the pandemic. That is why we at USAID have started a new initiative called Primary Impact, which is starting out by supporting 7 countries as they work to strengthen primary care: Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, Indonesia, Kenya, Malawi, Nigeria, and the Philippines. Through Primary Impact, we are working with these governments to identify the most pressing needs in the primary care system holistically, and then seeking to help fill investment gaps where possible in coordination with the World Bank and other funding partners where we can help the country meet these pressing public needs. Research shows scaling up affordable primary care by 2030 could save 60 million lives globally, build more sustainable and efficient health systems, and increase average life expectancy by 3.7 years. As the World Health Organization has put it, we need countries to make a radical reorientation of their health systems toward primary care. That is how we make a real recovery from the pandemic and protect and advance individual and societal resilience to whatever health shocks come. It is the only path we have back to a world of longer and healthier lives. Thank you for this chance to talk to you. I look forward to further collaboration with UNFPA and our global partners in helping to create a thriving, safe, and prosperous planet for all of us.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gawande, for your passionate remarks and the continued commitment of USAID to the health and equality of the world's population. Hopefully we'll have you in person next time. Now I would like to introduce Sarah Craven, who's the chief of the Washington, D.C. branch of UNFPA and our partner in developing today's event. Sarah, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I'm so happy to be here today, and I'm really reflecting on Representative Houlihan's comment about this being incredible. This is an incredible panel that we have today, and this is an incredible report. I'm also reflecting back, just to be personal for a moment, in 1999, I welcomed my first child into the world, a beautiful daughter, and her birth coincided with what was then called the Day of 6 billion. And so there were many who called her, we still call her sometimes, Baby 6 billion. So it's remarkable to me that in her 23 years on the planet, we've now reached a milestone of 8 billion, where the world population is reordering itself again. And like when we had the birth of Baby 6 billion, my daughter Anna, the arrival of the 8th billionth person on this planet and beyond is really a cause for celebration. We have healthier lives, increased access to healthcare, and higher life expectancies. But at the same time, the hallmark of this year of 8 billion is really a reflection on how diverse the world population is. We will see by the year 2050 that the greatest growth, or half of all growth, will happen in just 8 countries. And in some countries of the world, the median age is of around 50, longer life expectancies, as Dr. Gawande mentioned. But in other countries, the median age is 15. And we will also be seeing that the ranking of the world's most populous countries is changing now and will continue to change. We've seen many governments and the media respond to these dynamics, with considerable concern and anxiety. And we hear calls in some countries who call to limit family sizes. Others have banned free contraception in public hospitals. In other countries, women are urged to step away from their careers to become mothers. Over the past week, UNFPA, you've heard that name a lot today, we're the United Nations Sexual and Reproductive Health Agency, launched our flagship State of the World report. Again, I'm going to show it off like Sarah did. Here it is. 8 billion lives, infinite possibilities, the case for rights and choices. And our report's main point is this. We've been asking the wrong question. The question isn't whether the human population is too large or too small. The question is, can everyone exercise their fundamental human right to choose the number and spacing of their children? And the answer to that question is a resounding no. An estimated half of all pregnancies are unintended. 44% of women are unable to exercise bodily autonomy, unable to make choice about contraception, about health care, and whether and with whom to have sex. Also, many women would like to have more children and are unable to do so. The proportion of women who are actually able to meet their personal fertility aspirations is as low as 1/4 in many low and middle income countries. This is the policy space where governments can work most effectively to facilitate reproductive rights and choices, and where much work is still needed. Why is this? Well, this report can attest to many things. First, that young people around the world still need basic information about their bodies and their rights. Men and women still struggle with limited contraceptive choice or cannot access contraception at all. Our experience and research shows how structural conditions like sexism in the workplace and home can contribute to high levels of involuntary childlessness. And there also remain enormous gaps in the prevention and treatment of infertility. Fears about overpopulation and fears about underpopulation have long been used and continue to be used to exclude and harm people who may look different or live differently. Our report also shows that 500,000 births each year take place amongst girls ages 10 to 14 years old. Girls so young that they may not even realize that they can get pregnant. Girls too young to consent to sex, girls married off or abused or both. And until very recently, the world did not even measure pregnancies among those this young. I really want to thank Dr. Jennifer Schuba, who's from the Wilson Center here, and our esteemed panel, who will be diving deep into this report and talking about the questions that it raises. Today's discussion will finally start asking questions of population data. I should say other questions of population data. The question is about inequality. It is about rights and choices, who has them and who doesn't. In the end, population is about people. Evidence abundantly shows that when people are availed of opportunities, when they are healthy, educated, and able to exercise their rights, individuals and societies flourish. When the rights, dignity, and equal value of all people are truly respected and upheld, then we will indeed unlock a future of infinite possibilities. I'm really delighted to turn this over to our panel. And again, thank you to our virtual audience for joining us this morning. Back to you, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for providing us this great overview of the report and for your passionate commentary and your personal stories. And also thank you so much for your continued support of the Wilson Center. It's always such a pleasure working with you. So thank you again also to all of our opening speakers. And now, as Sarah suggested, let's dive into the panel discussion segment of this event. Before we do, just a reminder to all of you watching online, you can put questions into the chat box and we will be sure to get to those a little bit later. Today, our moderator is Jennifer Schuba, PhD. Jen is a fellow with the Wilson Center and is an expert on demographic trends and their implications for politics, economics, and social relationships. In addition to numerous academic articles, she is the author of the recently published book, 8 Billion and Counting, How Death, Sex, and Migration Shape Our World, and is just returning from giving a TED Talk focused on population. I can't think of a better person to moderate this discussion. Jen, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Sarah and the Wilson Center, and I'm very excited to moderate what will be a really dynamic panel to where we get to dive into these issues. You know, as I launched that book around the time of hitting 8 billion, I've noticed that at best, our rhetoric on population is stale and repetitive and very much stuck in this too many, too few. I could give a lecture at 10 a.m. and be inundated with people who just wanted to talk about how they were 8 billion was too many. And then I could go and give one at 11 and be told that there are far too few people and what are we going to do about it? At worst, rhetoric is filled with alarm and anxiety. And I think that's really what most of the media picks up on. So this report comes at an incredibly important time where awareness of global population is really high right now because we hit that milestone. And it does something very important in advancing the conversation, get us out of those places where it's stuck or where it is couched too often in fear. And so this report really emphasizes that with population, the point is not to think about dictating population size or composition, but rather refocusing on how are people living their lives? Are they living their best lives? And best are all those measurements that we've already heard about today. In some ways, we see great progress, life expectancy, some health indicators. And then in other ways, of course, they are not. And inequality is tremendous and people are being left behind. And so I really commend the authors of the report and the UNFPA for pushing us forward and getting us out of these very old and outdated and unproductive conversations about population. So we get to have a very productive discussion about population and one that includes demographic resilience, which I have to say when the report came out last week, I'm losing track of my weeks, but recently, the TED Talk I gave is almost to a T on this. The takeaway was get away from status quo, get away from fear, and build resilience because these are your trends. Stop trying to change them. I just love that. It resonated very much. So here we go. I'm going to introduce the panelists to you and keep reminding you that you can put questions in the chat. We would love to see those. We will hear from Stuart Geitel-Baston, who is professor of social science at Khalifa University in Abu Dhabi, where he is today. His research covers the links between population and policy, and often with a regional focus on Asia. He's been looking at the emergence of low fertility across that region and the consequences of that in terms of population aging and growth. Eliza Anyangwe is managing editor of As Equals, which is CNN's global gender inequality reporting team. It focuses on revealing, explaining, and considering solutions to the systemic causes of inequality, focusing predominantly on the global South. And Eliza is also co-founder of The Gender Beat, a project to advocate for more and better gender journalism. She's joining us from London. Lori Edelman is Vice President, Global Connect at Planned Parenthood Global. Prior to Planned Parenthood, Lori worked in feminist philanthropy, advocacy, and media, including with the Global Fund for Women, UN Foundation, and Feministing. And Lori's coming to us from New York. So my first question to each of you is to just give us an overview of what stood out the most about this report. So to you, what stood out the most about the report? And if we could, maybe let's start with Stuart.
Well, thank you so much. Sorry, I was in such a panic not to speak while on mute. I couldn't unmute myself, and I got panic about it. Sorry, because there's always one. Thanks so much for the question and for inviting me to this amazing panel. I think what struck me the most about the report is how we are talking about, as a demographer, how the report is talking about population in in a new and in a fresh way, but is actually kind of reminiscent of the challenges and the struggles that we've been through in the past. So it's kind of an important reminder, I think, of these issues. I mean, as demographers, yeah, and I know this point has been made already, but we tend to talk about numbers, about populations, about people, or groups of people, numbers on a spreadsheet to move around in a very kind of cold and mathematical way, because I mean, it is indeed a mathematical study of population. But of course, the first thing is that we forget the negatives, and this is one of the first important things. You know, as has already been mentioned, population aging is a problem because people are living for longer and are healthier, and that reproductive autonomy has increased over the last decades in many parts of the world. But despite that, we tend to be a bit of a gloomy bunch, right? A rather negative bunch when we talk about, and this goes all the way back to perhaps the first demographer of Malthus, right? Who, or you know, population scientist, that everyone's going to die because we don't have enough food and everyone's having too many babies, right? And of course, it's this very negative view. Even the language we use, be it like whether it's a silver tsunami, it's just pure ageist, right? Or the measures that we use of kind of dependency, and they're kind of wrong and inaccurate, and they're very gloomy. The population bomb, which is, you know, a very familiar metaphor. Lots of time bombs, lots of ticking time bombs in population. And you know what I think this report has done, and it did it in a very responsible way and in a proper and correct way, is to actually say, you know what, there are some challenges with relative population at the moment, right? We can't deny that. We can't pretend that the world that we live in, world of 8 billion people, a growing aging population, places where population is declining or stagnating in other parts of the world, very rapid growth, climate change, you know, these are issues, right? These are important issues, but we're not necessarily tackling them and approaching them in the right way, right? That we tend to think of them as issues on a spreadsheet, which we can solve on a spreadsheet. And, you know, we can't, right? It's rather than this top-down approach, we think of the population as being a collection of individual people. So how can we enable, how can we support everybody to be able to meet their full potential in life? And whether or not that is a population which is older and smaller, but may well be better educated, right? May well be healthier, right? So it's not just relentless blind optimism. There is a real kind of possibility of being able to do this. And of course, in a sense, we've been there before. We know in 1994 in the ICPD, the International Conference on Population Development, this move away from targets and a move towards more, you know, making sure everybody is empowered. But of course, everything has changed and everything has stayed the same, I think, since 1994, right? That we're now in a new world of low fertility, of pronatalism, of reactions to a rolling back of sexual and reproductive rights in many parts of the world. And so it was really, really necessary to restate these objectives back from 1994. So it's a long-winded way of saying that it was very exciting that it was able to look at these population issues in a new way, but still with a nod to the kind of ongoing challenges and fights that we've been having for decades and decades now.
Thank you so much. And what a great reminder that just we got to underscore is that a population is a collection of people, which the report, as we may hear in a minute, discusses some government policies. And I think so often those government policies forget that the population is really about aggregating individual decisions and behaviors. So that's a great reminder. Eliza, what stood out to you most from the report?
Yeah, thank you, Jen. Or if I may, Jennifer, we've gotten very familiar very quickly. Hello, everyone, and thank you also to the UNFPA and the Wilson Center for having me participate in this discussion. You know, it is one where we could start by asking, well, why is there a journalist here? Because this is a conversation that is virtual, but of course, part of the Wilson Center, DC-based, trying to engage policymakers. So the the question about, well, what does the contribution of the media have to do with this? And yet, I think the report said everything. So I think I'll take a step back first and introduce audiences to the work that I do. CNN, of course, is a global media organization that is best known for its coverage of breaking news events. And something that is essential in an age of a lot of information is high quality, slower, deeply reported journalism that helps diverse audiences make sense of the world around them, right? Give meaning to all the information. That goes steps away from the sort of inflection points of events and helps people see what is happening below the events so that they can see how factors relate one to another. And so this is really important when you think about the work of gender reporting, to take a structural view of gender, right? So to not just report on an event that is happening now, but to help audiences understand some of the deeper, more pressing questions, so that people might never encounter. And so what As Equals does is that we don't so much tell stories about women, we tell stories about patriarchy and understanding the dominant system of our age and its and the ways in which it creates winners and losers, and treating that the same as economic or political reporting to help on the audiences see who those winners and losers are, but doing something a bit extra and also thinking about solutions and approaches so that audiences are not just sort of running away from the doom and gloom. So when I gave in that context, you can see the sort of overlap with the concerns that whether it's demographers or advocates and activists like the other speakers on this conversation have, because narrative is so central to bringing the facts to life, right, and to giving those facts meaning and to creating a climate within which people then take action. So whether it is a positive environment for action taking, a vision of something better, or a gloomy environment, which then forces people or causes people to operate in a fearful way. So that's just the sort of, I have the wonderful privilege within CNN to move more slowly and to take into consideration these wider factors and then think about the reporting that we do. So the first thing that stood out for me from the report was frankly just its presentation. I don't think I have seen such an accessibly presented report in such a long time, given how loaded the subject matter is of population, that we all come to it, whether you know the name Malthus or not, with a sort of fear about the size of the world around you, particularly as we're increasingly urban and journalists live in the world we report on. And so when we're bumping shoulders in the streets or on a full tube or the underground in London, or seeing boats collapsing and people being pulled out of the water trying to access Europe or crossing into North America, that picture shapes our understanding of the world around us and thus also shapes what we might pick from our reporting. So the presentation, the easily accessible information was really important. And I really encourage everyone, irrespective of the work that you do, to sit with it a bit, because it helps, you grapple with the contradictory nature of the discussion, which I think is the second thing that really stood out to me, really helping us hold two contradictory points in our head at the same time, that in some ways and in some instances there are too many, and in some ways and in some instances there are too few. And so because these two factors are relevant and true, then maybe neither of them are the point, right? Finding that a really interesting framing, thinking about how I could, without being wonky, because we are not academics, or how do I start to think about stories of demographic resilience for our audience? And that was made easier by another point, which is that population is about people. I was like, oh, that I get. As a journalist, my job is to tell engaging human interest stories, right? To give facts a face, and to be able to say that decisions probably made in the global north or and elsewhere by people who have economic or political power to show the impact of those decisions on women and girls and genderqueer people in the global South, right? And telling engaging stories is our way of making a contribution to that information. And then finally, of course, media cannot tell people, or journalism, can't really tell people what to think, but we can help shape what people think about. And so how we cover a subject, the amount of time we spend covering a subject, how we frame that coverage has an impact on the kinds of societal conversation that we're having. And so starting with my own team, thinking about our own concerns and fears and lived experiences, and then thinking about how we translate that. I think the report was a really solid basis for engaging with both the specifics, but also the more sort of ephemeral kind of philosophical questions that we grapple often with in journalism, and then have to sort of think about how we translate into individual impactful storytelling.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I think it's more stories of demographic resilience will go so far to change the narrative on this. And I'm so grateful that you can be there to tell those stories. I think for those of you who have yet to read the report, you'll really be intrigued with the studies that were done and reported in the report about the role of the media. I loved it personally because there are things that I know to be true deep in my heart and just need somebody to have done the work, have that funding and have done the work to provide me with the facts so that I can support what I'm arguing. And they did that. And so there's so much in there about population policies and about the role of the media. So I think, and presented, as Eliza said, in a really accessible way with some fantastic graphics. So I absolutely hope that you'll all read that. Okay, Lori, what stood out the most to you from the report?
Yeah, thank you so much, Jennifer. Thank you, UNFPA and the Wilson Center for having me here today as well. And I really just want to shout out in this report all the different overlapping and intersectional ways that they talk about bodily autonomy, and the need to promote bodily autonomy is so present in this report. As they say, I think this report is right on time and not soon enough. There are so many conversations, urgent, life-saving, high stakes policy conversations, media conversations happening globally right now that this report speaks directly to. And so, just as Sarah Craven lifted up in the beginning of this, as well as Representative Houlihan, I think for me, the statistic that kind of stuck out and just hit my heart was the one around bodily autonomy and the fact that 44% of partnered women are unable to make decisions over healthcare, sex, and contraception. And I think that, I'm so happy we have media folks on this call today, because that should be the headline, the leading headline around the world. The fact that we have normalized this absolute violation of bodily autonomy. And this is within partnership for women. We're not even looking at the full picture. And as was mentioned earlier, we've only just started to track what this looks like for younger women, for women whose rights violations haven't historically counted as violations because they weren't even considered women or considered people for whom they have rights. So this is just shocking. The fact that this is not leading the conversation around the world and that we're sitting here talking about numbers and population, it is completely unacceptable. And when we're looking at the fact that half of pregnancies globally remain unintended, this should send a shiver down anyone's spine. This is a completely preventable situation, of course, by the way. We know exactly what it would take to shore up bodily autonomy. And we also know that these things are not felt equally. So even within that 44%, we know that Black women, Indigenous women, women of African descent feel this more deeply, more disproportionately. Those living in poverty, that is a huge factor as to whether or not you're able to have a say over your bodily autonomy. And so specifically, the work that we're doing at Planned Parenthood Global, which is the international arm of PPFA, is to grow the locally led, globally connected movement for comprehensive sexual and reproductive health and rights. And I think this report is the case for that. This report is the why for that, with incredible new data, and so many different important angles to look at this. I mean, you're reading about so many fascinating elements of this issue. You're reading about, as Eliza mentioned, the demographic resilience. You're reading about expats and repatriation. You're reading about stories of reproductive responses, creative responses in the face of reproductive coercion that women are having. They call it covert contraception, right? So there's all these small stories of resilience, of reclaiming of the bodily autonomy, and against the backdrop of what we're seeing globally, when we know that abortion access is remaining uneven and inequitable, even as technology and medical gains have continued to make it only safer and safer. We know that we're seeing a rollback of transgender rights in many states here where I am in the United States and also globally. We've seen a horrible anti-homosexuality bill be introduced in Uganda, which is a clear violation of human rights. So for me, bodily autonomy is the headline. It's the punchline. It is the everything, with an intersectional lens. So the opposition to this is fully intersectional. There's a whole section of the report about replacement theory. We'll get into this, which is effortlessly intersectional, right? In the sense that this connects all types of issues through the lens of white reproduction, abortion, immigration, feminism, anti-LGBT. So we need to be at least as effortlessly intersectional as our opposition is.
Thank you so much, Lori. I will be taking the moderator's prerogative and asking our panelists a couple more questions, but a reminder to those listening that you can put questions in the chat, and in about 15 minutes or a little less than that, we'll start turning to those. So Lori, what you said is so important to really point out. This is the way I've always framed it, is that if we point population trends as a problem, if we paint them as a problem, then policies become a solution, which is highly problematic. And because it pulls us away from remembering that a population is a collection of individuals, and therefore those policies are going to direct the behavior of individuals. And so what the report does, as you point out, is it making the rhetoric and framing around population as a problem is problematic because of what follows from that. And so, thank you for highlighting that. And I'd actually like to keep talking about that if we could. The central component of the report really is this idea of dictating population size and fixating on it, too many or too few. And in fact, one of my favorite graphics was a little more implied than overt, but is pointing out how leaders will see population size as too many and they'll have policies around it, and then all of a sudden it'll be too few. And it's like a switch that's turned on and off without ever hitting this just right point. I think it's like Goldilocks and the porridge. It's too hot or too cold, and it's never just right. And so this focus then comes down to women's fertility as the key. In the report, Eliza, you're quoted in speaking of population policies focused on a woman's womb. Can you talk more about this, please?
Yes, thank you. It was such a privilege to see, because during the work that I do, I think a lot about impact and how our journalism resonates, beyond our newsroom. And so for my words to live on in this way is really humbling. So, I was talking in a very time-specific moment. I wrote this opinion piece in the aftermath of comments that Prince William had made about, he is rightfully so, pro animal conservation, and that framing of populations, particularly in Africa, as the kind of the enemy of the animal populations, right? And that to me seemed and supported by lots of evidence, inaccurate for many reasons, and also incendiary, right? So the first point I was making was that here is someone who gets with his partner to choose his own family size, and beyond that, the facts that Africa, the ways in which Africa's population is spread out, the energy consumption of the average African, actually means that in terms of environmental impacts, Africa is not where we should be looking, right? We should not be so concerned if we're looking at environment, if we're led by our environmental concerns at the population size of rural women in Zambia. We should be looking at the average energy consumption of the average American household or the average British household, right? And so displacing our attention away from where attention should be placed if we are going to respond, as you have been talking about, Jennifer, with policy recommendations, but also just shaping the kinds of conversations that people have in their households, over the types of comments that they hear from someone who does not have political power, but doesn't indeed have influence and clout. And so therefore, the things that he says is reported on. The specific points that is referenced in the report, which is, when you listen closely to feminist activists, when you listen closely to women who or people who advocate for greater bodily autonomy, very much like the work that Laurie does, what you cannot escape is this sense that women, the womb is a site, is a territory of contest, and that the only person whose view of that is not considered is the womb owner, right? And so you have different people sort of having a conversation, a discussion, fairly animated, about how you address some other external problem, whether that is immigration, whether that is conservation, and then applying, a policy recommendation that seems fitting to address that, and that the person whose womb it is, therefore, is just then the recipient of those recommendations. Now, as someone who's obsessed with narrative and obsessed with conversations and discussions that are sparked in many arenas, whether that is through speeches like Prince William, stories like I publish, or even in the world of fiction, the ways in which population is presented in film and other spaces, it seemed to me really important to write a piece that was cautionary, to say, can we take a breath as we hear these remarks, because the site at which these policies are implemented is over women's bodies, and that fundamentally, if societies care and present themselves to be feminist, and we are seeing many more societies introducing feminist foreign policies, and after we're not after the pandemic, we're still very much in a COVID world, but in the middle of that, governments, particularly in the G7, the most powerful countries, talking about how the pandemic had shown up inequities across society, and wanting a gender equitable build back, and yet at the same time leveraging immigration or conservation as means to control the rights and choices of people elsewhere. Connecting those dots on those issues says actually perhaps a feminist response is to not, make the womb the site of these sorts of policy discussions, very much as the report is suggesting.
That's fascinating. I would like to know if either of the other panelists would like to comment on this idea that the sexual and reproductive health and rights, we're actually not just talking about women in lower income countries or marginalized women, women from historically marginalized groups. What the report starts to draw out for us is the universality of this experience. And, do you see a need for us to shift to pointing out that universality, or do you think that we would be wiser to focus on the experiences of subgroups that might be even more intense than this universal nature?
Well, maybe I can talk to that for a moment. So, I mean, I think that is, again, one of the benefits of this. One of the great things about this report is precisely in drawing out that kind of universality, right? And it's about making clear that it's not a competition, right? It's not that certain people are suffering more than other people, right? That this is we have a universal set of challenges whereby women's wombs are used as a tool to fix pension systems in other parts of the world. When you say it out loud, it's ridiculous, right? It doesn't make any sense. That's mad. It's complete madness. But this is the end consequence of a kind of a spreadsheet approach to looking at population. But I think it's also a consequence of looking for a quick fix, right? And of refusing to recognize that whether or not you're in Zambia or in Hong Kong or in Uzbekistan, wherever you are, the population challenges that you are that are being presented to you are presented in a very, very simple way, but they are the consequences of extremely complicated, complex, interlinked, politically difficult issues and challenges, right? And of course, given the choice between as we see in France right now, right, to talk about increasing the pension age and the political damage that is being done, in other parts of the world, if given the choice between saying, okay, we're going to have to do some very, very unpopular and difficult and challenging reforms, and you've got to think about this, it's a very, very complicated issue, or just have more babies. Go on, just have more babies. And they'll go, it's not going to fix anything. And I think, and that again, I think comes back to the framing of the whole thing, is that too often these challenges, and that's where this kind of demographic resilience notion, I think, comes in, right? That it's about, we have these universal challenges all around the world, and we have to respond to them. But the most important thing we have to do is to define them better. Because at the minute, I would say at best, a lot of these challenges are defined by pretty ropey science, by pretty shaky science. At worst, these challenges are defined by prejudice, by racism, by sexism, by xenophobia, by any ageism, by any other kind of phobia that you can think of. And, I mean, like even just today, we seem to be banging on about the UK quite a lot, even though this is a US launch. But even today, the Home Secretary of the UK says that illegal migrants to the UK, the problem with illegal migrants to the UK is they don't share our values. They don't share British values, right? So this is just not talking about that. I mean, there are challenges relating to illegal migration to the UK. We can't pretend that they don't exist, about why this is occurring, what happens, the death along the way, settling, etc., etc. But to turn this into a question of values is not moving us anywhere. It's regressing. It's taking us back, and we'll never kind of solve those issues, I would say.
Lori, do you want to add anything on this?
Yeah, just to the question about universality versus something more specific. I mean, I really would lift up everything my panelists have said, and would just add, from a movement lens, from a lens of what do we need to do together to advance these issues, to advance bodily autonomy. We need to be able to hold this nuance, and this has, if I can be frank, eluded us for many, many, many years. And it's part of why we're having, something of the same conversation that we had at Cairo, and that we've been having since then, because yes, every single person is deserving of these rights, and we need to acknowledge the universality of that, but we also need to acknowledge the different ways that this issue impacts people, and specifically along the basis of race, class, especially. So, when we hear the narrative that women are having too many children, these women are usually poor and of color, period. When we hear the narrative that women are not having enough children, these women are usually wealthy and white. These are the factors of our current scenario. It is driven by racism. To Stuart's point, there are dog whistles everywhere you look and listen around this issue, and to not name that is harmful, I think, to what the report is trying to do. And what I really appreciated about the report was them talking about really some of the very important historical ways that this has backfired. They talked about the population bomb and some of the ways that rhetoric was so harmful. We just can't forget that history, and we can't blame communities when they're skeptical or when they say, actually, we're skeptical of foreign support for these for family planning, for example, because of these histories. We need to know those histories, acknowledge those histories as we continue to fight for health and rights. And so it's that balance of the universal and the disparities that I think is tough, but so important.
Thank you so much for that. Absolutely. We do have a couple of questions from our audience, and please feel free to submit more. These questions, I'm going to ask them both together at the same time, and you can jot down if you need to, which I always have to, but these are about dialogue and values. And so the first question comes from Kathleen Mogelgard, president of the Population Institute, says, we work with partners who create new champions for reproductive rights by demonstrating that slower population growth would improve prospects for achieving many development goals, including universal access to SRHR. How can we encourage this dialogue without resorting to population alarmism? This is a huge challenge, as all of us know, as we try to say population's important, but only don't freak out and have knee-jerk reactions in terms of policies. And the second question comes from Sonia Michelle, Professor Emerita of History and Women's and Gender Studies at the University of Maryland, who may or may not remember that I was once in her class. How can policymakers deal with the fact that in many of the world's cultures, women's autonomy, bodily and otherwise, is simply not recognized as a value or priority? And I think we all know that this is a big question we get, whether from the media, students, researchers, et cetera, in the idea of how far do you let culture have power here? And I'd be curious how you all would respond to that. So I don't know who would like to answer first, but please feel free.
Go on. I'll take a stab at the second. Probably not. I should need to find some less violent metaphors. I'll have a go at the second one, and speak briefly to this because, of course, as a journalist and as an editor who commissions stories, these are some of the tensions that I sit with, right? I sit in the global north and have specific perceptions of my own life and what I would like to enjoy, and report on women and gender issues predominantly in the global south. And the question of culture is an extremely important one because I do not want myself to be presenting solutions that might be foreign to a particular culture. I want to be able to speak truth to power, to identify how cultural and social norms might impact upon women, girls, and genderqueer people. But I also want to resist suggesting that the way it is where I am is the way it needs to be, right? And I don't know, I think perhaps my esteemed fellow panelists will have a sort of longitudinal sense on the impacts of getting it wrong. But as someone who was born and raised in Cameroon and have family all over Africa, I feel that that I don't have to worry about this too much, because if I tell the story with a human lens and show the impact of certain cultural norms and decisions, the question then of so what, I have to work with other people, particularly in that community. My reporters have to be listening to what do people in that community say they want the solution to be. And if that does not chime with what I think it needs to be, that is essentially part of a question of someone's rights. And that actually the work that I do sits within an ecosystem which includes education and other changes. And so if we tell the story today, the answer might look different to if we tell the story in 5 years, but sort of trying to transpose onto a community my own ideals seems to be problematic. So from a journalistic perspective, all I can do is, report what I see, work with local journalists who have a better understanding of the social norms and context and the ways in which to elicit women's views. And, because even in reporting, sometimes women do not speak freely in front of the men in the community. So really taking a considered view on how we elicit from them what they might value and prioritize, and think about how to tell those stories even to an international audience that might value and prioritize the different things, right? So, the sort of surfacing stories and allowing women in the global south to have voice in our reporting so that they're not just victims of someone else's agenda is the way in which I approach this, and reconcile myself to doing my work in an ecosystem where other people have other roles too. And so then everything, when working together might shift the dial forward.
Thank you so much. Lori or Stuart, would you like to give any comments on this idea of dialogue or values?
I mean, definitely agree with you, Eliza. I mean, the role of the media is so critical. The work that you do is so important. And I would just emphasize in this why a locally led movement for these issues is so important. It's not just like the right thing to do, but literally there is not a scenario where we win rights for folks globally. If I'm sitting here in New York saying what should happen somewhere else, that is just not a winning strategy in a number of ways. And so we do need to build our muscles of partnership, of transnational partnership and solidarity around these issues. And it is something that, historically we have seen so much harm happen around this. And it's so important to acknowledge that before we can just say, well, why isn't everyone jumping to work together kind of across borders, across difference? Well, there are historical reasons for that. So I think it is important to meet people where they are, but you can't assume that you know where they are. And so, I without going into too much of the details of of different models around this, I think it's really important that we figure out the logistics, the politics, all of what it takes to support locally led movements that are communities leading their own solutions. And I truly mean that in a very broad sense, and not as a talking point, but really that is I think the key issue that we need to do to kind of get to the next step in these discussions.
Thank you so much. We have a couple more questions that I'm going to go ahead and ask and then I'll go to you first, Stuart, because one of them I think is a good follow-on to what we're already talking about. And so one of these is, how do the panelists feel about the African demographic dividend roadmap? And so just for our listeners, the idea of the demographic dividend would be, can you invest in your population when you have relatively more workers than dependents, and therefore reap a greater economic benefit from this? So how do you feel about this roadmap and framing, and about trying to achieve the demographic dividend? Is it a new way to control population in the name of development, because low fertility is kind of lower ring fertility is a prerequisite to that? Or can this idea of the African demographic dividend be framed in more of a reproductive rights lens? So I think that one's quite relevant to the discussion we were just having, but I'll go ahead and tee the other one up as well, which is, what evidence do we have about the emergence of coercive pronatalist policies in countries with very low fertility? Is anybody tracking this in some sort of systemic way? So yes, Stuart.
Okay, I'm going to try and answer all 4 questions really quickly, because I can actually group them together. I think the first question about slower population growth and the prospects for development goals. And this notion of African development, African demographic dividend, I think we can possibly group them together in a way to say that, of course, whenever we're talking about things which go together with demographic change, whether that is demographic dividend, whether or not that is, in a sense, progress towards other development goals and so on and so forth, that's fine if we're talking about this in a complementary way, but this is not necessarily what our goal should be, because again, we're just falling back into the trap of having this kind of top-down, target-driven approach. Now, I know that's not what neither of the people asking the question are talking about here, but I think as long as these approaches are made in this bottom-up way, right, in a way of improving autonomy, then if demographic dividend comes along in certain African countries as a consequence, then that's great, right? But that's not necessarily the end goal. And of course, we also know with demographic dividend does not come along if you've not got decent employment, if you've not got gender equality, if you've not got good governance, if you've got corruption, if you've got frustration. As Jen knows very well, that can even take you down a very different avenue, right? So again, these things just show us about how we shouldn't be oversimplifying these issues, which not for a single second suggesting that's what the panelists are suggesting. That last question on coercive pronatalism, yeah, I mean, we are seeing this in different parts of the world now, without naming any names, but of course, this again, it raises its ugly face in funny ways, right? In some places it is through, restricting access to reproductive health and family planning services. We've got plenty of examples of that. In other workplaces, it's a kind of constant pressure and stigmatization of particular family sizes, particular groups of people, rewarding or penalizing certain people for deciding to have certain. I was tempted to talk about the UK again and child benefit, but I'm not going to, right? But kind of penalizing or giving benefit to certain family sizes or certain people who have families. Again, this is nothing new. This is old eugenics. We've been doing this for hundreds of years now. So here we are. That's still back in the saddle in many ways. But this is being tracked. I mean, the UN, the UNFPA, various different organizations around the world are engaged in this, as well as scientists such as myself. And then just very quickly, the last one on how policymakers can deal with the fact that world's about women's autonomy is not recognized as a value or priority. Again, just to echo Laurie and Eliza about, we have to be very culturally sensitive. We can't give a prescription from anywhere around the world. But to me, I think a simple thing to say is that you've got to bring men into this as well, right? That men have to be part of this discussion, and men have to realize that giving up, the empowering female empowerment, improving women's autonomy is not giving up your own power, right? It is not necessarily about giving something away as some kind of act of charity or powerlessness, which I think is how some people around the world make a living out of presenting this these days. Rather than it's not a zero-sum game, it's about bringing everybody up together, and whether or not this is men as partners, as boyfriends, as fathers-in-law, or business owners, of politicians, of journalists, whatever it is. Men have to be a greater part of the I don't want to say the solution, but certainly a greater part of the dialogue to this.
Thank you for that. I feel like we need a separate event where we can keep talking about that one, because that's a juicy one. Lori and Eliza, we're getting close to time. Would you like to, and we can go a few minutes over, but audience, do not worry, we will not go more than 5 minutes over, but I'd love to hear from either or both on these other questions about Africa's demographic dividend, or if you want to talk about coercive policies in low fertility settings. Thank you.
Well, just quickly on the question of, men's involvement and, just the need to bring more people into this work, and the need to change hearts and minds. I think that's really, really important. And education is key to this. I love the part of the report, not the actual finding, but I think it's really an important part of the report. The chart that showed the gender difference among respondents who viewed their national population as being too small. So who feels this way, who feels that their population is too small, that view is more likely to be held by men than women, who largely are not the ones putting in that reproductive labor to change that status. And I think these are just important things to name. The data helps. I think that, we haven't talked about comprehensive sexuality education, but actually making sure that everyone, people of all genders, are learning early on the ways in which these different issues impact them, that they're getting a framework for understanding their own sexuality and that of other people. I mean, these things are foundational. And I think it's really important. When it comes to demographic dividend, I mean, I'm probably the rights based person here, or we've been talking about sexual and reproductive health and rights, so it won't surprise anyone that that's the framing here that I would bring. I definitely think it's important to talk about young people's opportunities and to be able to frame these issues in terms of the opportunities that to use the youth bulge, that these folks actually have. But even just the language, I think for most people, it's not useful unless you're a researcher, unless you're a policymaker. It's really important to show that the intersections between, health rights and opportunity for young people, and to show that to a variety of people so that we can make this case better. I think that's a much more humanizing way to look at it than to talk about, achieving the demographic dividend, and to also talk about the fact, what the report also says is that we're getting longer lives and somewhat higher quality life, and to talk about the ways in which that, what are the things that are driving that, and how can we build that too. So I think it's important to lift all of those things up in any conversation about demographic dividend as well.
Thank you. Eliza, do you have anything you'd like to add?
No, I was just trying to be respectful of people's time. I guess my final thought would just be that, the report has been both challenging and encouraging, challenging in that particularly because it talks so much to the role of media and about framing a narrative, thinking about how we have made, in our focus on the exceptional, in our focus on if it bleeds, it leads, have perhaps, contributed to a misunderstanding of what the, and actually a compromising of rights and choice, but also an opportunity, because then we can, particularly with a team like As Equals, tell more human interest stories driven by facts and data, such as the data presented in the report, and really think about how we might help audiences understand these global dynamics, right, in a way that allows them to feel empowered to advocate for the right kinds of action. So, really grateful to be able to be involved in this way. Thank you for including me.
Thank you all so much, Lori, Eliza, and Stuart. What a dynamic panel. And I really learned a lot from you and wish that we could keep talking, but we have indeed run out of time. Thank you also to Representative Houlihan, Dr. Gawande, and Sarah Craven for your wonderful opening remarks. And Sarah Craven and the UNFPA, thank you for this fabulous report and making this event possible. And thanks to my colleagues at the Wilson Center for organizing this. The event recording will be available on the Wilson Center event page by the end of the day, or tomorrow morning at the latest. And then we will have a summary of this event that you can remind yourself and share around on the .mom column of our blog, New Security Beat. Thank you all so much for tuning in, and have a great rest of your day wherever you are.